Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another episode in our series, Coffee Conversations, which is part of the Wealth Cafe. My name is Caroline Tannis, and I am so excited today to be joined by Kelsey Carter and to give you a little bit more insight to who she is. She leads the internal learning and development as well as the employee experience function at a mid-sized consulting firm. She builds and executes a company-wide learning strategy that focuses on all the various forms of learning, especially those through human connection. And we are going to dive into all of that today. So, Kelsey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, give us a little bit more of your background because I know your story having shared with me. And I just think the way that you came into this role is so incredible through your experience right out of college and how everything came to be. So, please share more about your background.
Yeah, so I actually chose HR when I was in college. In my final semester, I was going to college for accounting, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not the lifestyle that I'm seeking. I didn't want the 80-hour work week, so I leaned into HR. Shortly after college, I actually decided to join the Army National Guard, so I took a little bit of a pivot in my career, which I can explain in a minute if you want me to explain how that one happened. But then I decided to come back into HR. I was doing HR generalist work and realized that the area that I was best served in, the thing that made me excited to go to work, I was really happy with it, was learning and development.
Mm.
And it's because I could draw so many parallels from my own life over into learning development. And I can truly say I'm one of those really weird people. I don't feel like I'm working when I'm at work. I genuinely have a great time. I love what I do. I'm constantly learning myself. And so I have that learning personality where it's really fun to work with others. And selfishly, I get to stay away from some of the harder sides of HR that other people are really, really great at.
That is incredible. And as somebody who also prides himself on being a lifelong learner, I love the way that you've then embraced that throughout the different parts of your career. So tell us a little bit more about your time in the military. So how did that come about? And I know you learned so many formative things while you were there, and I would love for you to share that with everyone.
Yeah, so it is actually an interesting story. Like I said, I went to college first and then decided to join the military. Shortly after I graduated, I actually graduated from a four-year university at the age of 20. So I was very young. And so I
Wow.
had flown through school. I graduated high school early, I graduated college early, and I sort of had this mini like life crisis. And I was like, oh no, like what comes next? What am I really going to dive into? And I realized that my life had to have more purpose. I couldn't just keep checking these boxes. I couldn't be like, okay, great, like I got a degree. Do I go get another degree? Do I go for a master's? Do I just start working in the corporate field? I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I knew that I needed to do something bigger than myself because I had this desire to serve others.
Mm.
And so I went down the path. I decided to actually join the Wisconsin Army National Guard. It was a little flavor of both, right? Like I got to stay in the corporate world, but I also got to do the military side of things. Which it ended up being great. My military service actually got cut short because I became a single mom about 2.5 years into my 6-year contract. So I did not finish out my 6 years in the Army. But like you said, I did actually learn a lot of great things even in the short amount of time. The military teaches you so much about yourself, but it
Yeah.
also teaches you about other people, and certainly a lot of what matters most. So I think, especially in a training environment, you kind of have that moment where, wow, this is hard. This is taxing physically. This is taxing mentally. How am I ever going to get through this? There's this concept of embracing the suck. Like you don't really know fully what the end result of this training exercise will be or what you're really diving down into. But you're surrounded by people, and we're all doing the same thing. We have the same mission, whether that's in training or, you know, a lot of my friends went on to be deployed, and they certainly felt the same, is that you're surrounded by these people who truly care about you. And nobody's in it for themselves. It's not this dog eat dog world. Nobody's fighting for the next thing. Like we all just really want everybody else to succeed. And it didn't matter what somebody's background was. It didn't matter how they voted. It didn't matter the color of their skin. Nothing else mattered other than the fact that we were all wearing that same uniform and that we all had the same goals and we genuinely started caring about people in a way that I hadn't necessarily seen it in other ways, but then I did start seeing it in other ways once I really recognized that. And even afterwards, there's just like brother slash sisterhood of being a veteran. As soon as you find out that somebody else is, it's like, oh, like I got your back. And
Mm.
I do wish that we saw that more, like, hey, you also work there. Hey, you went to that college. Like there's that shared connection. And I think that that's like what we try and seek in so many different ways. Like we want to get to know other people, and when we have something that we share with them, it's a lot easier to do so.
I love all that. And I also want to thank you for your service. No matter how long it was, I still think that's incredible, especially to what you were able to then learn and bring back into the civilian world, right? So few of us, and this is once again for those of us that I'm definitely not strong enough to go into the military, so I am they don't want me, but it's amazing though to be able to then learn from your experience. And I am fortunate to sit here and have this conversation with you. So thank you for all of that. And you learned so much too about that leadership and development. And I want to touch on what you said about we don't always have like we want to find that common bond, but I think in workplaces a lot of times I'm trying to put the right word to it, and I hopefully you'll be able to pinpoint this with me, but a lot of times like we fight that connection. And I think it's a lot harder to have in a virtual world. And so how in your teams and through your workplace are you helping then to cultivate that sense of connection and I don't really want to say family, but just that core bond of like we are in this together and we work at the same place and we're all here at the same time for a reason.
I think there's a few different ways to cultivate that. And I think being in both learning development and employee experience, I sort of get to see like the overarching, like how are we actually doing this, or how do companies sometimes try and maybe they miss the mark a little bit. A lot of times it actually happens more organically than not. But, one way certainly is through shared goals. So same with military, right? When you have that shared goal, ideally a company has a top set of goals and that's cascaded down. And so everybody sees themselves in the future and they see themselves in that goal, even if it's at that, an annual basis, or maybe it's a little bit shorter, but it's, hey, we're all working towards this and we all have that in common. I think learning in itself can actually bring people together. So whether that's creating like a talent pool, like, hey, all of you are all managers or all of you are early professionals and you're still trying to grow, but even as something as simple as, hey, we're all trying to learn the same skill right now. So maybe somebody's trying to learn like how to sell when you're not a seller and you just want to
Mm.
have this growth mindset, especially in the consulting world, like that's really prevalent. And you just all realize like, hey, I want to learn this, hey, I want to learn this too, and you start having those conversations and that connection. And so learning or skill building can actually be that connection point for somebody that's like, hey, I actually want to do that too. Like let's have a conversation, let's meet weekly, let's do something, or let's take a training class together. And when you start building some of those intentional connections, then the connections last well beyond. And the skills or the learning, it doesn't necessarily need to be, hey, I work at the same place or I'm on this team. It can really extend past that in order to build that.
Which it's interesting because as you were saying these things of, you're going through a common course, learning curve, moment in time together, right? So that builds that connection. And as much as there was a lot of tragedy that came along with COVID, that was like, you look back on it and around the entire globe, we sat there and were able to connect with one another on this shared experience in a way that we never have before.
Absolutely. But what I do find really interesting and something else that I've dug in a little bit into and tried
Oh,
to
let's hear
learn
it.
from others
Yeah.
is even when we're all experiencing the same thing, we can all have a different version of reality. And it's what
Mm.
am I bringing from my past? So,
Ooh.
or where am I sitting in reality today? So like when I went through COVID, I was in a position where we were in office. I had to transition to remote really quickly. I was a single mom at the time, so I had to then have my daughter home with me, which was interesting because I didn't have any other help. I had also signed a document originally with that company. It's not my current company, it was a previous one that was like, I'm committing that my daughter will not be home with me when I'm working, blah, 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 blah. Like it's just one of those typical employee agreements because you're supposed to have daycare. And I couldn't do that because it was COVID and
Yeah.
these really, really big shifts happened. But at the same time, I live in a very small town. And so I didn't see a lot of the things that other people saw. Like my grocery store shelves were still filled and we weren't rushing to get things that other people didn't have access to. We still saw people, like our schools were still open. My daughter was very shortly after that at a very, very small private school. And so even like masks, like these young 3-year-olds, we didn't do it because we're in this really, really small church community. And that was so unique and different. And I had actually a hard time talking about COVID with other people because a lot of my colleagues were in these really big cities,
Yeah.
Seattle, Chicago, New York. And they just have a complete opposite experience. And so while we were experiencing the same thing, we were coming from very, very different lenses. And that can happen even on a closer scale. So somebody in my same community was experiencing it even differently than I was, but we were sitting here experiencing the same thing in the same room at the same time, same everything else was there, but we didn't have that same thing because of something in our past or our own fears or our family dynamic. Like when I came home, it was just my daughter and I, versus I didn't have a husband who was maybe like going and interacting with the public in a hospital setting, right? Like that'd be such a different experience. And I think that that's the piece of human connection that sometimes we almost forget. Like it's maybe really natural for me. Like I can always empathize with somebody to say, I recognize that my situation was so different than somebody else, even though I was also going through something very hard and scary and life altering. It was a huge change. But I knew that somebody else was still experiencing that differently than I might have.
It's interesting too. It's like the whole concept of like you can have 100 people, and I do a lot of speaking at different companies, and when I go in, somebody could sit here and interpret something I said and be like, "Oh my gosh, that's the greatest thing in the world," and somebody else could sit there and listen to it and be like, "What in the world is she talking about?" Everyone sat in
Absolutely.
that same room, and we've all been in that position, right? Where like, and I could think of 5 times off the top of my head right away if I sat in a room and was like, "What in the world?" And it's like there's three sides to every story, right? And it's also too, though, it feeds into, like you said, your past, the way that you've also, I think, to kind of go back to this learning and development, some people who have spent more time in the learning and development space or trying to grow personally, they're going to interpret different things differently than somebody else might.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the way that our minds work and how we learn and how we interpret everything can all be skewed and changed. It actually makes my job very difficult in some ways because how am I going to present the same information and everybody's going to take that differently? Some people will take action with it right away, others won't. It does make skill building very difficult in the classroom setting. And that's why I always try and say that learning is so much more than that. Learning
Right.
happens everywhere at all moments
Which
of the day.
Yeah, and it's continuous, right? I mean, that's why we're so exhausted at the end of the day because what is it? Your brain is making 30,000 micro decisions every day and taking in all that information and interpreting it. Like, I can think even this morning when I went on a run, like, I'm deciding, okay, which way do I want to go? Do I want to take this route? Do I want to take that route? Like, somebody might prefer running here, whereas I prefer there. Like, we're all in the same city running, but it's everyone's having a different experience,
Absolutely.
which is so crazy. Which leads me to another question I have for you. So, we are in a world where there's more information than ever, right? Like you can listen to a podcast. Somebody could be listening to this episode now. They could read a book. You could take a $10,000 course from somebody, whatever it might be. So, it can feel overwhelming, right? It's almost too much information where you're like, oh, where do I begin? So, you've had a really incredible self-development and learning journey. What are some tips and strategies that you can share for those listening who typically, I will say, our audience leads very busy lives and they're trying to figure out, similar to you, like how do you manage all the different pieces? What are some things that they can do to take control of their own learning and development journey?
I mean, most of it boils down to just start, right? Simply do something. Obviously, it's more nuanced than that. I fully respect the very busy lifestyle. That becomes a lot of habit stacking and finding out what works for you, but also learning about yourself. So, are you somebody who can sit down and read a book? Do you have time for that? Do you enjoy that? Um, do you process information that way? I'm somebody who does not, right? So I actually listen to Audible or audiobooks because that resonates a lot better with me, but also my lifestyle. I'm always on the go. I'll listen to it in the car while driving. I'll listen to it at the gym. Like I gain access to information more quickly that way. But that doesn't mean that somebody wanting to sit down and read a book is inherently wrong or like that they shouldn't slow down and do that if that's how they want to do it. But
Mhm.
I think that that goes to getting to know yourself. So even in the virtual world and working remotely, I'm like the perfect candidate for that, right? So I am introverted in the sense that I truly gain energy by being alone. So that's not to say I'm not super outgoing. I can stand on a stage in front of hundreds or thousands of people and present anything that doesn't make me fearful at all. But I gain all my energy and my creativity by being alone and not being surrounded by other people. I also have a really high ADHD. And so working from home really works well for me, but that might not be the same case for somebody else. So if somebody gains their energy by being surrounded by people and maybe they do find themselves in a virtual environment right now, maybe they should be someone who seeks out a co-working space or a job that does go in person so that they can find their own creativity. Because when you understand yourself and how you learn and what fuels you and gives you energy, learning comes naturally. You will seek out the learning. You'll be able to break through the information and the barriers. You won't just look at it like, wow, we have this endless amount of information. You'll start seeing that as, I know exactly where to go look. I know what skill I want to chase next. I know who to have the conversations to help guide me, to tell me which skills I should be working on, maybe be able to see some of my faults or my deficits. But until you get to know yourself first, you won't fully understand that.
It's so interesting. You have to understand who you are and also how you learn. Because when I've found for my own personal, learning journey when you're very far removed from a classroom is the ways in which have the freedom, right? To finally embrace, and like you said, you sit at home and you need that space to focus and that alone time. Whereas somebody else might be like, I need to be surrounded at like a Tony Robbins conference with 10,000 other people screaming to get the information. Neither of these is wrong. And I
Yeah.
think for so long, a lot of us have been told, like, you need to sit at a classroom, you need to sit with a book. Like, I personally am somebody, if you sit down and ask me to watch a documentary, forget it. Like, it's not happening. If you want me to watch a
Same.
2 hour movie or a documentary, there's no way. But if you physically hand me a book or even give me a podcast to listen to while I'm taking a walk, I will fly through it. But it's interesting, like there are other, and you might be sitting here being like, oh my gosh, why would anyone ever? And that's the cool thing is that we also now live in the world where you can then focus and hone in, like you said, just on those areas that you enjoy.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really hot take if anybody else is listening and they work in corporate learning. But I think for a
Let's
long
hear
time
it.
we actually got corporate learning wrong. I think we tried to create and create and create. We tried to make it individualized for each individualized learner. But now I go off of this. I'm going to create the framework and then they need to be able to customize it themselves. I'll give them the information and then they need to take and run with it because that's actually what adults are best at. As soon as they get information, typically, if they truly want to know the information, they will take and run with it in the ways that they need to. They will go practice it in the ways they need to. They'll go back to the information in the ways that they need to, whether that's maybe they go watch an online video afterwards, maybe they go read a book afterwards. But I think what needs to happen first is people have to shake their perspective. And so we went through, elementary school, middle school, high school, it was all this check the box learning. And then college got even worse. It says, hey, if you go through these prescripted classes and you finish them all with a set level of grades, then you're going to get a diploma and there's a little reward at the end, but you have to check every single box first.
Mhm.
Well, our lives in the corporate world or even in our personal lives, it's not like that. I can't just simply check 10 boxes and say, wow, like I have this skill absolutely nailed down. And
Yep.
like it goes to that 70-20-10 model, right? So a lot of people focus so heavily on that 10%, but there's a reason it's supposed to be 10%, and that's like the classroom-based learning. So
Hmm.
more away from some of that, sit down in a classroom and learn that skill because you can learn it better if you're focused a little bit more on some of the human connection side, which is through that mentorship or even on the job learning. And we have to find ways to more intentionally replicate that human connection side of the learning, not just the learning that happens regardless if anybody's trying to intentionally craft it, but doing those skill buildings intentionally inside of those other areas.
I love that. And one of my favorite things is if I listen to a podcast that I love, I have a certain set of people in my life who I know also love podcasts. So I'll send it to them and then having that human connection to talk about it and debrief after. It doesn't, it's once again, how you mentioned you're like, I love to work because it doesn't feel like working. It feels like learning. I'm learning, but it doesn't feel like I'm sitting there studying a textbook. But the amount of knowledge seeping into my brain is 10 times over because I listened to it, I reinforced it with a human connection, and then now take that back into my work or my personal life every day.
Well, and sharing it with somebody is sort of that same concept of you're going to like watch one, then you're going to do one yourself, and then you're going to teach one. And sometimes we can replicate that teaching somebody else something by simply sharing it, waiting till they also absorb the information, then going back and having a conversation with them. Coffee chats are a great way to do that. So I actually love that, your little segment's called coffee chats because that is how people can come and do a really low lift of learning with almost a bigger impact than something that was well crafted and it took me 6 weeks of my time to put together this whole presentation and the PowerPoint and the facilitation guide, and then somebody goes and sits through the course. It's like I almost could have done that by creating less and just doing more with people getting in the room together and having that connection and speaking with one another and learning from their own experiences because we as adults, we all already have experiences to lean off of.
I also find it really interesting. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Is I like having these videos and then they are out here for people to listen to 10 times over. I had a book come out in November and I encourage people, I'm like, come back and read the book different times and points in your life because each time you're going to pick up something different. So I'm curious too, if you've seen this in your own learning journey, you can put somebody in front of something one time, but they have to be in the right mindset, in the right space in their life, in the right time to be able to take it in and actually hear what you're saying. And so I hope that people listen to these conversations and come back in a year and say, oh, you know what? Now I really want to work on this. So I'm curious your perspective and also how you've seen that kind of play out in your own life.
Absolutely. I think that is 100% a very real thing. There's the sayings, right? Somebody has to hear or see it 7 times before they really absorb or learn it. But it also goes back to this always has a negative context. I don't mean this negatively at all, but somebody's own version of reality, right? So my life experiences change the perception of how I am as a person. A really great example for any parents listening is, how I thought I would parent before I became a parent was very different than I am now. And my experience has led me to change how I am. Uh, I am definitely somebody who will go back and rewatch videos or re-listen to books. Atomic Habits is one of those books for
Mm.
me. And every single time I listen to that book, I end up finding a different way. So, like, whether I'm stacking a new habit or I'm replacing one, and a lot of that is something else that I do specifically in my life, and that I call it expanding my why. So, I don't necessarily feel like I have to always know exactly what my why is. Like, oh, here was my why. Here's why I'm learning this thing, because even that can change. And as I come back and review my goals or just check in with myself and say, hey, like, why am I still doing this thing in my personal life right now? That's powerlifting. Like when I first walked into the gym, I didn't plan to be a powerlifter, but I accidentally stumbled into a powerlifting gym. And I was only going to the gym because I wanted to be. I had this reality moment. I was like, oh no, someday I'm going to pick up my daughter for the last time. I'm going to set her down and I won't be able to pick her back up again, or it just won't happen. And I was like, oh, no, I'm going to be strong enough. Like I am going to pick her up even if she's 21 years old. I will be able to pick up my daughter. I'm gonna
Wedding
have the
day.
strength. Wedding day, it's fine. Like I will be able to pick her up, no problem. And then it kept expanding. It's like, well, now I'm chasing. I'd like to be stronger. I'd like to chase the next segment on the board of the SPD board where my total gets bigger and I can move my name down there. And now I'm signed up for a sanctioned meet. And so it's not that my why ever changed. I still want to be strong enough to pick up my daughter someday, but it keeps expanding and I keep adding these micro goals onto that. And I think that that goes back to that, right? Like coming back to the same concept at a different point in my life. I'm not doing what I did before. I'm just doing it differently, and that's okay. I'm still learning and I'm still learning the same skill, but I'm doing it in a different way that's really meaningful for my life right now.
That's awesome. And it's part of evolving. And I think once again, too, when you mentioned the thing about parenting and it's okay, yeah, you can say you want to parent like this. Well, when a pandemic hits, even though it was, a little bit of a different situation where you were because it was a lower population, that still affects everything going on, even if it's at a smaller scale than, I'm right outside of New York City, right? So we took the brunt of it was a little different time.
It's very hard.
But it still impacted people everywhere, and that is going to change how and why you do things. And we also now live, I think, in a digital world that's really, yes, we've lived in a digital world for a while, but we saw COVID um, accelerate that exponentially too, in terms of, yes, learning, but also the way we work. So I'd love to kind of end our conversation talking a little bit about human connection in a digital world. And I know I run a digital team, and so you want to have the beautiful connection and continue to build things. And so, how can we continue? And I'm asking this selfishly for myself. How do I continue to evolve and grow, learning and maintain incredible human connection in this virtual world?
So I think I'll start by saying it absolutely is possible. And I think some people just really need to hear that because a lot of people are saying, well, it doesn't feel possible or it's just not the same. And in some ways, it's not. I think back to I had a job at a bank, and when we were in person, I learned like little keyboard shortcuts by watching my trainer do that, or I learned how to or how not to speak to customers on the phone by listening to others, right? Like there are elements that we absolutely are missing now that we're in a virtual world. But that's not to say that we can't still create connection. It's just going to look a little bit different and it will be intentional. So, same with learning is happening all the time, but we can craft that to be intentional. So, a few points that I would probably say is lean in, don't shy away from it. Just really find the way that works best for you and the people surrounding you. So, get to know yourself first, but I would encourage everybody else on the team to also get to know themselves. I recently went to a leadership summit and spoke with somebody in person, and he was saying he doesn't feel like he actually knows somebody until he knows how tall they are, meaning he truly doesn't feel that he knows somebody until he's seen them in person. And in a way, I can kind of understand that because there are elements of that face-to-face connection that we can't replicate. But if that's something that's really meaningful for somebody and that's something that the team needs, then just try and find a way. Like, is there budget where you can all come together once per year? It doesn't need to be this like weekly ongoing thing to be able to create that really meaningful connection. A couple other things. Don't ever say something that you wouldn't say to somebody's face. Always assume positive intent from others and just really embrace the fact that we want diversity of thought. Being in a digital world, because we have so much heightened access to information, we are also getting bad information and maybe information that's causing clutter in our minds. And we're feeling strong emotions one way or the other. I think politics is somewhere that we start seeing this, and somebody feels really strongly one way, or they feel really strongly the other way. But we have to remember that everybody comes with this really wonderful and beautiful set of things that make them uniquely them. And it should matter less that we are complex humans with these great backgrounds, and we have all of these great things, but we don't need to figure all that out. We just need to just say, I love that we are all different and it's okay to all be in the same place differently. So I think we just really need to break through that noise, break through some of the barriers that we think that we can't do it, get to know somebody. It's very interesting. Virtually, you actually can know a little bit more, but you can also hide it. So a lot of people who have different abilities can hide that. Maybe if a woman who got pregnant can hide her pregnancy a little bit longer, maybe that's a good thing. But also, my coworkers often will see my daughter run in the room and they'll get to know her. And I think that that's beautiful and wonderful. I actually really appreciate that. My coworkers really appreciate that. And they get to see a different side of me and who I am. And so I lean into that. If somebody wanted to protect that part of themselves, they get to do that. So all of that I just said, though, goes back to just getting to know yourself and what's going to work best for you, and then choosing that, hey, I'm going to create these intentional human connections and I'm going to reach out to people when I need to reach out. I'm going to have conversations when I need to have conversations. A lot of that becomes some of it's one-on-one and some of it's in a group setting. And even if that's virtual, as long as you have some of those conversations and you get everybody to have a voice, everybody will feel a connection in some meaningful and powerful way.
It's funny being in the world of finance as I am, everything is typically very buttoned up, right? Everyone's like suits and how do I, show as little about myself as possible. And when the pandemic came, that all changed. And so I have a weenie dog. And at one point I was on a meeting with a very large client and he hopped up on like the table. He like got up on there and walked his entire slinky body across the camera. And I thought, I was like, my career is over. I was like, this is it. These clients now who are very like, buttoned up people, whatever, they love this dog more. And they ask, they go, how is he? And I'm like, I'm good too. Thanks for asking.
I'm
They're like,
great.
yeah. And they like send him toys. I'm like, geez, like, but it's so funny. That would have never happened in if they came to an in-person office, right? I do
Absolutely.
have some limits. He does not, he stays home. But it's like we forget, I think, a lot of times that that is a human connection, right? Like I love when I was on another call the other day and the my client's dog also they had the kids with them and the dog walked up he was so big he walked up to eat the kids' dinner off the stove. So there was like mayhem and it was so human though. And I'm like, this is what it's about. And yes, I think I love the idea of coming together like once a year, right? You can still have that in person, and then you need to then continue to build off of that in a virtual world and continue to grow that way. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing society.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to what where we had kind of started that everybody's seeking some connection point with somebody else. So
Mhm.
somebody sitting on that call, maybe they also have a dog, or maybe they also had that moment where their dog came on camera and they were mortified. And it's like, wait a minute, like we are all human. We can't control our very human lives. And maybe that's finally a good thing. Like the pandemic did give us some really strong positives with human connection for some of those realism ideals. Like I love that. I'll lean into it. I know other people maybe hate it a little bit, and hopefully maybe they'll come around and find their own version of that connection.
Yeah, I agree. I hope to some extent everyone, and to whatever extent they feel comfortable, they embrace it because we are human. People get sick. People's, internet goes down or tech doesn't work or, the kids get sick. Like it's okay. And I think we're now also trying to move to the place where it's like we forget that people are still human beings.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
the root of all of it. Well, I like to end every cafe episode and coffee conversation with a little question for you. Are you
Oh,
ready?
good. Yes.
What is something that you do every day that just makes you feel wealthy?
Probably count my blessings with my daughter. Looking around and just seeing what we have and what we've been given. I know I will often pull in my driveway and after I pick her up from school and I'm just like, wow, like this house is mine, this car is mine, but way more importantly, we still have each other. And so we could lose all of this in this moment, but that's maybe not what makes us wealthy. It's that if I had to restart, I could do it all over again.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a lot of times. That's why I like to ask this question because so many people think wealth is about money or like everything that you can buy. And I'm like, it's what you can do with it. And also in the moments that it's not about the money. Like, yes, it's great to go on vacation or do those things, but it's about what you're doing there with the people you love that really matters.
Absolutely.
So that's awesome. If people want to connect with you, if they have any questions, I will link all of your information in the show notes, but tell everyone too, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Probably on LinkedIn. That is the best way to find me. But I did recently start a new Instagram. I wanted people to get to know me a little bit better. So I called it Learning Kelsey. So you can learn with me, learn from me, or even just learn something about me. So I am over on Instagram as well now.
That's awesome. We'll make sure to tag you and everything. And also, I highly recommend Kelsey has a lot of really great clips from her different speaking events that she's done. And I love to watch them and learn from it as well. So, thank you so much for coming on and sharing everything human connection, learning. And it's just such a joy to be able to learn with you. Of
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it.
course, bye.